Hello everyone, welcome back to Maximum Automation. Today in this video, I'm going to explain how we can perform exception handling in Python. When we have an exception in the program, then that exception will terminate the execution. So it is important to handle the exceptions. And when we have an exception handled, then we can further perform the operation based on the exception occurred. In Python also, we have a mechanism to handle those exceptions. Let's say, for example, I have this MyList object over here, and let's say I want to print this MyList object. I want to print the item placed at 7th index of this MyList object. Now, if I want to run it, you can see that we have got the exception that list index out of range because we don't have any item placed at 7th index. We can see it starts from the 0th index and then we have the item up to 5th index. So we don't have any index value for 7. If we get these kinds of exception, then our program execution will stop. Let's say if I want to print length of my list, and now if I run it, you can see that the moment we got the exception, the program stopped the execution. And this print statement never gets executed. So whenever we want that, okay, we know that there might be some exception in the line of code which we have written. And if there is an exception, then what we can do, we can handle those exceptions to plan what next steps to be executed once we have that exception occurred. So to handle those exceptions, we have a mechanism in Python that is called try and except block. And to add that, I can type try and then let me add the print statement over here. Make sure that we are adding the indentation over here. Then I'm trying to print the MyList object. And let's say if there is an exception while executing these statements, then I can catch those exceptions by typing the except statement. And then here I can type index out of range exception. And now if I run it, you can see that it printed index out of range exception. And it printed my list count as well. So this is how we can handle the exception. Whenever we have an exception in our try statement, then we can add our statement in the except block. Currently, in case of any type of exception, this except block will be called because I have not specifically mentioned the exception type for this except block. Let me show you an example. If I add an except over here also, and this time let me specify the exception type as index error. Here, I specifically mentioned the index error. So whenever there is an index error, so this block will get executed. And this block will be called for the exceptions other than the index error. Now this time the cursor won't go to this block. This will come to this block because we have specifically mentioned the index error over here. Now if I run it, you can see that it displays the index error and it did not print the length because it did not go to this block. It went to this block. But if in case I have an exception which is not an index error, then it will again fall back to this except block. Let's say if I add a statement here as I equals 5 divides by 0. So here is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to divide 5 with the number 0 to get the exception because we cannot divide any value with 0. Now, which message will be printed in the logs, either this message or this one. Let me change this message exception here. And now if I run it, you can see that this printed exception occurred and with the list length count. Because when this statement got executed, then we did not get the index error exception. Instead, we get another type of exception, and that is the arithmetic error exception. Now this time, let me add another except block here. And let me add the error as arithmetic error. Then I'll add a print statement. This time you'll see when we'll execute this statement, then it will go to this block because here we have specifically mentioned the arithmetic error. So when this statement will throw the arithmetic error, then this will come to this block. And if it is an index error, then it will go to this block. And if it is not an index or arithmetic error, then it will fall to this except block. Now if I run it, you can see it went to arithmetic error block because the error which is thrown by this statement was an arithmetic error. So this is how we can handle the exception in Python. Then in Python, we have finally block also as part of try except statement. Python provides a finally keyword or statement which is always executed after the try except block. Finally block always execute whether there is an exception or not. Let's say that I want to add a finally block over here. And let's say under this finally block, I always want to print the list count. So if there is an exception or not, I'll get this list count always printed into the console. Now if I run it, so we had this arithmetic error and it printed the list count. So even if we have an exception, then also this block will be executed. And let's say if I update my statement over here, and this time I'm going to divide the value 5 with 2 so that it won't throw any exception. And now if I run it, then you can see it printed the list count in the console. Because this finally block will always get executed irrespective of whether any exception occurred or not. Also, let's say if we don't have the except block and the statement we have also throws an exception. And now if I run it, see we have the exception displayed in the console and the list count is also printed. So this block is always going to print whether we have an exception occurred or not. We'll always get this list count printed, which is defined under a finally block. This is how a finally block works in Python. In Python, you can also raise a specific exception. Let's say if you want to raise an exception in case of something going wrong, then instead of occurring the exception naturally, you can also raise that exception by adding a raise statement. So what you can do to raise the exception, you can type a keyword raise and then you can type the exception like arithmetic error. And then what you can do, you can also print your message in the exception. Now if I run it, you can see we have this arithmetic error and we have this list count printed as well. Now let's say that I want to raise another type of error. For example, I have different kinds of errors and let me choose the error as connection error. And now If I run it, you can see it moved to this block where it's saying exception occurred. Even if you want to raise that exception in the case of except block, you want that exception to be highlighted. In that case, you can again raise without sending the name of the exception. So you don't need to specify which error. It will automatically pick the exception catched by the exit block, and then it will throw the same exception. Now, if I run it, then you can see it says the exception occurred, and the exception occurred is the connection error. So this is how we can raise the exception manually. Then at last, we have an else statement also as part of the try except block. Let's say if my code does not have an exception, then I want to run a specific code. But if I have an exception, then I don't want to run that code. So for that, Python provides else block in try except statement. If the try block does not raise the exception, then it will come to the else block. And let's say I'll print no exception in that case. So here, if we don't have any exception in the try block, then this statement will get executed. But if we have any exception in the try block, then this statement won't get executed. Let me again change it to 5 divides by 0. So first I'm going to throw an arithmetic error exception. You can see that it throws the arithmetic error, and we don't have any no exception error occurred message printed into the console. Because when we have an exception generated in the try block, then this else condition won't run. Now let's say if I don't have an exception, now if I run it, you can see that this time we don't have an exception. So it printed the no exception occurred into the console. It moved to the else block and performed the further steps. So in case of finally block, the statement will always get executed, even if there is an exception or not. Finally, statements are always going to execute. But in the case of else block, it will be executed only when you don't have any exception. So based on that, you can add the else statement. But if you want the statement to be run every time, irrespective of exception occurred or not, then you can use finally. So this is how you can use a try except block in Python. I hope you liked this video. Please put your comments in the comment box. Also, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.